balance of risk.
Let's go ahead and get started. This morning we have Karen Clay. Good morning again. This morning we have Karen Clay, who's the professor of economics and public policy at Carnegie Mellon. She's done all sorts of interesting work related to institutions and governance and so forth, including stuff on land demarcation in California, which is a fun topic, and a very nice book on geography and institutions published a few years ago, and about which I wrote lovingly in a review a few years ago as well. So Karen is going to talk to us about energy and resource endowments and economic growth, and she'll present get us started for 5 minutes or maybe a little longer, and then we'll take questions, and I'll take the cue.
Okay. Well, thank you, and I'm delighted to be here. It's such an honor to be in the Ostrom workshop. This picture, if you haven't already guessed, is from the Bakken. It's just to give you a sense of one of the resources we're going to look at. This is joint work with Rita Portnick, who is a postdoc at CMU. As probably you've sat in enough seminars to know that this is a widely debated topic, both at the international level and at the U.S. level. The literature is not quite as large in the U.S. context, but certainly a voluminous literature around this issue of what is the impact. One of the things to note here is that these tend to be sometimes a little bit narrow, right? So we're often in the literature looking at one resource. In the U.S. context, often looking sometimes at subsets of counties and not at the whole U.S., and often looking at relatively recent time periods. So this actually connects well to Lynn in the following sense. Gavin Wright and I were at a conference at the Lincoln Land Institute, and this, I think, was in some ways spurred by both the conference and interactions with Lynn and Gavin about this idea that we have really fantastic data for the U.S. going back for long periods of time. And so we should really be trying to use that to overcome this sort of narrowness, look at multiple resources, look at the whole U.S., and really look over a long time period to better understand what was happening, at least in the U.S. context. I don't want to overlook the fact that there are some excellent papers, including Michael's paper, which he sent me a couple of days ago. And so there's some nice papers on short-run effects. And again, lots of interesting work. There's many more than, but these are just sort of the ones that I think are most closely related. And we'll talk a little bit about them depending on how the discussion goes. There's also literature on the long run, but again, the narrowness issue. So you should think of us as building on these literatures to sort of enrich the story and push the story back in time, among other things. We're going to use panel data for 48 states starting in 1936. We're going to look at 3 resources. You might wonder why oil and gas are together. It's really data. And coal and agriculture. I'll talk more about these 3 in just a second. We're going to look at primarily the 2 main outcomes that people are interested in these literatures, which are population and per capita income. And then we'll look at some ancillary stuff, again, depending on the time. These are just showing resource production in 1936 and in 2015. And the thing you should notice is that in both time periods, these are the most valuable resources, right? So agriculture, coal, and oil and natural gas. This is what's happening to national resource employment over this time period. And you might wonder, like, why did we just stick that red line in there? It's primarily because we're going to do some subdivision by periods. And so that line represents where the periods are divided. The things that you might notice include the fact that agriculture is secularly declining with some upticks and downticks, and the same is true for coal. In contrast, oil and natural gas is sort of flat over some periods and is sort of at a local high right now. So they have actually quite different trajectories. So we're going to be interested in these different trajectories, partly to understand that, but also to understand the difference between these renewable and non-renewable resources. So oil and natural gas and coal are non-renewable. Agriculture is renewable in some important respects. In particular, we might expect that they would behave differently because you can produce a different crop mix in response to changing market conditions. Whereas, you can make decisions about how much to produce, but generally speaking, you can't change the mix, at least not very much, when thinking about oil and natural gas and coal. This is just for people who like to see income. If you're thinking about what's happening during this time period, this is the big oil uptick. And so you can see that there's much more of a boom-bust cycle in this second half, and somewhat less of a boom-bust cycle in this first half, depending on which resource you're talking about. We're going to rely on this model, which is described in the paper and also in their paper, by Alcott and Keniston of domestic Dutch disease. Short-run implication is pretty much what you get out of these models typically, which is a resource boom is going to cause population and wages to increase in the short run. And in the long run, that the relative welfare effects can be signed by examining relative population. This is going to be specific to the US context, right, where we have free movement of population, right? So that wouldn't necessarily be the case in some other contexts that you might be considering, but in the US context, I think this is a perfectly reasonable thing to look at. The empirical approach is going to be this sort of Bartik shift share, where the shares are these state resource endowments in 1935 per square mile, and we can talk a little bit more about that if you're interested. I'll show you a map in a second. The shift is going to be these changes in national resource employment that I showed you a minute ago. We're going to take a flexible estimation approach, and what I mean by that is we're going to allow increases in resource employment to have different effects than decreases in resource employment. That's because the literature has found that that matters, and in fact, we do some estimation where we force these coefficients to be symmetric, and you really make, or are at risk of making some sort of weird inferences, right? So it really does matter. The other thing we're going to do is we're going to look at a 5-year interval, and the main reason we think this is important is because we don't necessarily think that these, any kind of spillovers are going to be manifest in 1 year. So often they're either inserted contemporaneously, so then they have to have a sort of instantaneous effect on population and per capita income, or they're in there with 1 year lag. And so, again, depending on which resource you're talking about, maybe that makes sense in some context, but we find that actually the 5-year intervals, I think, are sort of a more appropriate duration to look at some of these things. So these are the resource endowments. We've scaled them so that the top state is a 1, and that's just for convenience for the interpretation. It doesn't really matter. You can scale them any way you want. And so what you can see is the states that you would expect to be high oil and natural gas are high oil and natural gas even in 1935. These are the agricultural states, and again, the sort of resource intensity is in the Midwest. Now, one thing to note is that we use, turns out this does matter. Here, we're implicitly, or explicitly using the value of the resources. Here, we're using the value of the resources. Here, there was a question about whether you want to use the value of the agricultural land in 1935, or whether you want to use just agricultural land, but not the values, right? And so we do some robustness checks. In the end, our main estimation actually is using the value of the land in 1935, which is going to reflect the fact that some states have a lot of land in agriculture, but it's not particularly valuable land, and other states don't. So it does matter, and we do it both ways. Okay, so what do we find? The main thing, which I think is probably sympathetic to this sort of Ostrom approach and the people in the room who are institutionalists, is that for the short run, different resources have different short-run effects in different time periods, and across increases and decreases in resource employment, and across different outcomes. This shouldn't be terribly surprising. I mean, the thing I find sometimes surprising is that people would assume that you would have a constant effect over 20 or 30 or 40 years, right? You might expect that there would be different effects, and so the fact that people sort of constrain it so that you have one estimate of something over this very long time period, is a little surprising. And I'll show you a picture that sort of illustrates this a little bit. For the long run, the thing that I think was so interesting for us is population is the primary margin of adjustment, right? So population changes which is partly driven by migration. And so you're seeing these declines in states with larger coal and agricultural endowments. Okay, so here's the picture. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time in interpreting this for you, but the thing, we can come back to this if you're interested in the specific details. But the point was really to illustrate for you so this is increases in national resource employment, not state, but national, because we're interacting it with the shares. This is decreases. These are both from 36 to 74, 75 to 2015 increases and decreases. And then we've got population growth and income per capita growth. And the main thing you should be able to see, hopefully even just looking at it, is it does look like there are different effects in different time periods. So, for example, if you look at population growth for oil, it's positive during this increase. Interestingly, it doesn't fall during the decreases, right? So booms generate inflows into the high-intensity oil states. People don't particularly leave. And then you can see this in the income per capita, right? That you see these increases in income per capita, and then because people don't leave, you see these big decreases, right? And so there are sort of different effects, but also if you compare the effects across the different resources, you see different outcomes. So let me just show you the other piece. This is the piece where we're losing population from states with high coal endowments and higher agricultural endowments. And what you can see is that they are losing population relative, again, not necessarily in absolute terms, but relative to other places. And so, over this 40, either 80-year time period or these 40-year subsegments, you are seeing migration out. And so the thing that you can see in terms of income per capita is that this is largely equilibrating the income per capita over this long time period. That doesn't mean that there aren't impacts in the short and the long run. The other thing I want to do to use my last minute is just to talk about the very long run welfare perspective. So if you think about starting, right, one of the things about a boom-bust cycle for resources is you have a boom and you have a bust. But from the perspective of a welfare planner who's sitting at time zero, you're going to be happy about the boom, right, if it's generating some benefits, even if they eventually get diluted by people migrating in. There's going to be a period in which there are positive benefits. Now, there may be a period in which there are actually some negative benefits, too. But depending on your discount rate and the relative magnitudes of those, you're basically going to probably, under most circumstances, still be happy about these resource booms, even if they come with a bust. So the thing to keep in mind here is that all three of these, if you go back to the 18th or 19th century and you think about coal or agriculture, and you ask, was it good for those states to have those endowments? The answer is yes, right? But it turns out that they peaked before our sample period, and so they peaked in depending in the very late 19th or early 20th century. So you've got this long secular decline. So of course people are unhappy, right? Because there's this long decline and period of adjustment, including slow population growth, which is making the governors of those states very unhappy, among other people. But probably going back to this economic history debate about, for example, what was the importance of coal, which is a big subpart of this. Coal's probably good, right? We're just in the downturn part of the coal. Interestingly, for oil and gas, we're just at a different part of the cycle, right? So oil and gas were actually approximately at a local optimum in terms of employment, and so that's going to have somewhat different implications, both in this sort of estimation, but in terms of how people think about it. So, okay, I think I have now run way over my allocated time, but
because of that, we can hit you hard with questions now.
Excellent.
Michael first, I'll put Nikos next, and just raise your hand.
All right, thank you, Karen. So it's very interesting, this really long run view. But so I have some technical issues. I'll talk to you later about it. But this paper is mainly, I guess, about the effects of rents.
Mhm.
The effects of rents on your welfare, on so this and that. And I'm not sure that national employment and population changes really reflect those things. Moreover, you are also looking at personal income, and I know that others are doing that too, so it's not like, but say national employment and agriculture. So I think that farmers are actually nowadays pretty happy, or even though there are very few of them, because so they're making a lot of money, but because of technology, especially over such a long run, what do changes in national employment reflect? So I'm not sure. I'm pretty sure, though, that they don't reflect the changes in rents. And if you also look at the personal incomes, they miss big shares of rents also, right? Because an oil company, it may be making profits, hand over fist. Some of it, or some of the rent, it goes to the workers and their wages and all that, but I would think that much of the rent goes to the headquarters. So it's not like I have an ideal solution to this, but we need to keep in mind what we are after, and it would be good if you can comment on what you think about where the rents are here and how they are reflected in your measures, or both in your instrument and in your outcomes.
Yeah, so this is an interesting question, and it actually had a nice discussion already today about this issue a little bit. So I think the answer is, first of all, we know there's been a lot of technological change. The rents are going to depend a bit on a couple of things. So for oil and gas, say in Pennsylvania, where people own the rights, the rents are actually, to some degree, going to landowners, although they're obviously also going to corporations. In cases where you have coal mining, it's going to depend. In the West, a lot of the coal mining is happening in federal and state lands, where the rents are dictated by that kind of transfer. In the East, a different kind. And then, obviously, the rents are going to depend on who owns, like, the agribusiness and things like that. So I think the rents are going different places in different, depending on which resource you're talking about. What we're capturing is very much a kind of macro level view of, what's happening to population, what's happening to per capita income. There is a separate, and I think really interesting and related issue about where are these rents going, and also to what extent are they being captured by the state so that they can then be used for policy purposes around natural resources or other things. So the answer is we're not accounting explicitly, but we can have a much longer discussion offline. Yeah.
Nikos.
So I'm going to jump on the technical question that Michael wasn't going to talk about. So I assume the reason you're using the national employment and scaling it by the endowment is that there are no data on state level employments at the sector. Is that right?
No, so the issue is, this is a way to get at the endogeneity issue, right? So when you use these shift share techniques, you're basically trying to, we have state level data on employment, so that's not the reason why. Yeah, sectoral. Yeah. It's that, and in fact, we do some estimates to see what happens in sectoral employments for some parts of the paper. But the point here is that you want to allow if you think that at least the national shifts in resource employment, sectoral resource employment, are plausibly more exogenous than a state-specific one, and then you're asking, is it related, is it higher in places with higher resource endowments, right? So the shift share is really a way to get it at this endogeneity, at least to some degree.
So you're not concerned about the fact that what you are implicitly saying about multiplying the share times the national employment might not be.
No, it's exactly that, right? It's exactly to get around the endogeneity issue.
Could I just follow up? So I thought in your paper you used the endowment of resource per square mile.
We do.
And you multiply it by the national employment changes. And you actually mentioned even there that early on there were no data on sector-specific employment.
Well, so we have data starting in '69.
Yeah. But I want to follow up on that because, so I can understand that the national employment is exogenous, but why measure it per square mile?
Yeah.
That sort of resource endowment. I mean.
So we could talk about some other things. Let me tell you why we do this, and then I'll tell you about some other things. And it turns out, actually, it doesn't matter among the set of things we've already looked at. It doesn't mean it might not matter in some other things. So the per square mile is really to adjust for the fact that different states are of radically different sizes. And if you want to think about state A versus state B, right, and I ask you, does state A have a higher endowment of coal, for example, then one thing you might want to take account if you think it's going to be impacting the state economy is just if it's a huge state, having an endowment is going to be different. Now, it turns out that you can do it based on population in 1929, and it doesn't actually make all that much difference. And so, and we also do it based on what if your knowledge of these things changes. So we also do in 1935 based on 2015 knowledge versus in 1935 based on 1935 knowledge, because of course things like fracking only come on the scene recently, but maybe we should be accounting for the fact that these places are eventually going to get fracking even though they don't know that in 1935. So we do some robustness, partly in terms of the timing, like what do they know when, but also some robustness in terms of population. Now, of course, what you don't want to do is you don't want to let it move contemporaneously with population, because then you really are creating a whole bunch of endogeneity problems. So, yeah.
Lee, and then queue's open after that.
Yeah, so a couple of issues. One is, when we think about these very long-run welfare perspectives in these booms and busts, some of the literature, particularly around fracking, has been about other issues like tax base, who gets the rents?
Yeah.
Is it, if it's coal on federal land, does the state of Colorado get anything from that or not? Migrants to these areas tend to be young males who make high wages, go to bars, get drunk, commit crimes. So you also have a bigger hit on the, crime, public goods, schools. It sort of seemed, we're both economic historians, so the world is moving much faster now in terms of migration alternatives that people had of moving in and out. I'm actually surprised at the oil and gas finding that people aren't moving out as much. How do you explain that?
Well,
do you have the demographics?
so
during the bus.
So I think two things are true. Don't forget, this is a 5-year time horizon, right? So it's part of it is how fast do they move, right? The other thing that I would speculate, right? We don't know for sure why aren't people moving more quickly. Is that two things? If it's down here, it's probably I'm not going to be able to get another oil and gas if I move to, say, from Pennsylvania to Texas. I'm probably not going to be able to get a job there either. So it may make sense for me to stay, particularly if I'm optimistic. And you saw that, right, that it's going to turn around in another year. So maybe I work some odd jobs in construction while I'm waiting for the oil and gas to come back. So I did have, again, this very interesting conversation this morning, because I do think there's this important issue which really shows up in Pennsylvania about what are the effects in Pennsylvania versus what are the effects on Pennsylvanians, right? And it's precisely these people moving in from Texas to do fracking, who are then, sure, they're coming, they're spending money, that has some benefits to the economy, some costs as well, as you were talking about. And so we're not measuring what the effects on Pennsylvanians are, and this kind of comes back to this distributional question. I should also say, because I think a little bit of this is you're in the Ostrom workshop, where are the institutions? And so let me just tell you that we have thought a little bit about this, more than a little bit, actually. The first thing we thought was that we thought the South might be different. And we spent quite a lot of time actually looking at this South, non-South distinction. It just turns out that empirically, we don't see it in our data, right? It doesn't mean that, because the reason to look at the South versus the non-South would be that people often think that the institutions in the South are somewhat weaker, or at least different, perhaps more corrupt in some cases. And so you might see sort of differential effects that would be manifest. And we don't see it, whether that's just because it's not there or because we can't see it in the data, we don't know. We also, this project had an origin in a master's student project. He was very, very interested in, like, where is the severance tax money going? How is it being used to benefit education versus is it being used for other purposes? So I think that there is a lot of institutional stuff that is sort of lurking below the surface, but a lot of it is that both because of the style of the papers, which certainly Michael's familiar with and probably many others here, of the papers in this literature, which tend to look at these issues and really not talk too much about institutions. And so we wanted to speak to that literature with this longer data set. And we just couldn't kind of match the institutional stuff in too well. And the fact that we couldn't really find some simple institutional stuff to talk about means that it's mostly still lurking below the surface and not actually super visible in the paper, at least as you've seen it today.
Well,
So if you have ideas.
I have maybe an idea. I have a question. I'm going to go first, then Michael, then Alex. So you read something like this, and I'm wondering, well, what are the mechanisms here that are driving these effects? And then the other thing is, there really is no governance of resources here. And I wouldn't have thought South versus non-South. I would have thought federal land versus private land with respect to oil and natural gas, not for ag. And then even on private land and oil, we have really different institutions in the 30s than we do now. And so Texas, you have all this rural capture, oil and gas exploitation. You arguably have way too many people in oil and gas because of that at the time. So I'm not necessarily suggesting what you do here, but you could at least look at the share of oil and coal coming from federal lands, and you might even be able to control for pure rural capture regimes in oil and then after, something like that. So it's not good that there was that many people in oil and gas in Texas in the 40s. Probably could have done with half of them, produced the same amount of oil. I mean, some estimates suggest it was even worse than that. So, and in California, oil and gas was rural capture intensively during these periods too. So, I mean, it's a different paper really, but I might ask you just to think about those things.
And we may be able to bring that in because, I mean, this is, by the way, if you look here, right, so this is increases from 36 to 74, and what you see is that there's a huge standard error range. There's perhaps a positive, a few people going in, but you see that during busts, actually, people are also leaving. And you're not seeing much. In fact, the point estimate for income per capita is negative, and again, during busts it looks bad. And so the question is, for example, here oil looks good, right? Maybe not so good here during the bust for income per capita, but generally, you're getting some benefits from these booms. Not so obvious you're getting that from these booms in this earlier period. And so I actually have wondered kind of how to parse what exactly is going on there. And I think some of it is exactly this rural capture sort of stuff that is leading to very quick and inefficient.
Yeah. 1950s probably.
Yeah.
40s.
And so that may be, the other thing I have some graphs on, I can dig through the presentation if you're interested, is of course, there's these huge technological changes over time, which are also having big impacts, obviously. All of this, of course, is driven by changes in resource employment. So the fact that the technology, this is measuring, in some sense, the spillovers from the jobs themselves. And we've done some exploration for looking at things like income.
Yeah, just on
Oh,
your
sure.
point, Dean. So, I mean, I think part of you're controlling for state fixed effects, right?
Yeah, although we have some specifications where we're not, yeah.
But we doesn't like state fixed effects because it
Yeah.
sometimes throws the baby out with the bathwater. So Dean's right about Texas, Oklahoma as well, not as severe as Texas in terms of rural capture and so on. But other things that vary a lot by state are whether you have surface and subsurface rights or not. So for coal, I think in Pennsylvania, a lot of the subsurface rights are owned by the coal companies, and they're digging underneath people's houses, and people know that, so it affects all kinds of things. But you would think that those kinds of institutions would make a difference for discount rates, for booms and busts, for both decisions by individuals as well as corporations. I think I wasn't surprised by the South thing either, because the South upholds contracts, and these are national markets. But these other things that vary by state, in Colorado, it's a big deal that someone didn't know that they didn't have the rights to subsurface, and oil company shows up on there, starts drilling, and we go, well, no, you didn't really read your
Yeah, I know.
contract very well, because you don't own the land underneath your house.
Yeah, and I mean,
So-
this is super useful in
It'd
the
be
sense that,
interesting it'd be a different paper.
yeah, but at least having some sort of simple, clear measures where we can go after those clear measures and try and see, do they matter in this period, do they matter in the later
Right.
period? The effects might differ depending on a variety of other factors, but
So we have Michael, Alex, and Jim.
Yeah, to that point, before I forget, we actually tried to use institutional measures. I mean, so there are all kinds of institutional measures, but unless you talk about the kind of stuff that is truly exogenous, you get into these indigeneity problems. But to the extent that it's not driven so by indigeneity, it turns out that the states with better institutions actually benefit more from oil rents. But the other thing I wanted to mention is that you talk about population growth as one of your indicators. But then, of course, I think it would be great if you used some spatial econometrics, because it comes, it's easier for the population to come from the neighboring state than from the faraway state. And maybe I would put also to abuse my turn here and still push a little bit more about rents, because when I talked about rents, it was not only the issue of where they go, but whether in principle changes in national employment. I mean, what do they really measure? What do they, I mean, especially over such a long run, it's just, it's not clear to me. I know that Alcott and Keniston use also the same kind of a shift share thing. So when I actually checked the correlation between the price of oil, so WTI price, and the national employment in the oil and gas sector is pretty low.
it is, yeah. No, and so we actually were interested in this, I think it's only a couple of things. So we've actually done some parallel estimation with this for precisely the reason that you talk about, which is we were wondering, well, yes, there is this sort of model and a framework of Dutch disease, and we should definitely look at that, but what happens if you either estimate it with income instead, which is just a different structure, right? It's you're asking a different question. It's not, you know, one versus the other. You can do both. And then some other robustness checks where we actually even did both, right? To try and kind of, you know, where you put them both in and you just run the horse race to see whether it's employment or income. You know, in some cases they sort of both matter, and you know, but it gets pretty hard to interpret once you put them both in. But it's easy enough to do the same kinds of exercises. And I guess, you know, the main thing I would say here is, you can generate. I don't think we actually have generated, but we can generate that same picture using income, for example, you know, which would be, I think, your question. And
well, sort of, yes.
yeah, or at least more closely
Yes,
related
yes.
to your question. Let's put it that way. You could draw this picture, and again, it would be different, right? And the main point is going to be, again, I think people tend to think like, oh, oil is a curse or oil is a blessing, depending on your priors and what your what your knowledge of the literature is. But I think that that's a huge mistake, right? You have to ask a much more nuanced question about what resource and what time period and what outcomes are you actually specifically looking at. So I think in that sense, you and I are agreeing. You know, just to some degree, I think this reflects the fact that we're slightly interested in slightly different things than you guys are, which is good, right? Because we can cite you and you can cite us, and we will all be happy because, you know.
I want to be happy. That doesn't sound welfare enhancing.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't stop academics from having debates about the fact that, you know, you believe you're asking the right question. I believe I'm asking the right question. Whatever. We can both ask both questions, and I think they're both important. So, you know, this is the important thing.
Alex.
So on this point, which wasn't the question I was originally going to raise, but I was just curious, if you redo the shift share basically with price, national price, it's harder to do that with agricultural, of course, but for just oil and gas, is the set of compliers for the IV different across those two when you do it with employment versus price? Because if you get similar estimates, but it's different states sort of contributing to the power, that's interesting.
So, first of all, just to be clear, we're not doing an IV. That is, this is not an instrument. You should think of this as a reduced form, and it actually comes out of the model, right? So, and so the question would be, are you getting different effects from different places? Since we're interacting it with the endowment, I mean, the answer may be yes implicitly. I'm not even sure how to test that, but I mean, we're sort of forcing it to be related to the endowment. I mean, so it's probably a little bit different, but.
Yeah, it could be informative what's going on. But also, my main point was, I was really intrigued by the idea of what you brought up about trying to get at the heterogeneity between why you get different results across oil and coal and things. The idea of new wells, like how often a new well comes about versus how often a new vein or shaft, I don't know the right way to think about it from coal's idea, versus how often maybe there's a drought in agriculture in these different areas. It seems pretty intriguing to see if you could get heterogeneity even within product across those different dimensions. It's probably easier to get drought with agricultural to see if that sort of varies, but that seems like an implicit test that you sort of offer.
Yeah, we one of the reasons why we think, even based on the 1935 endowments, that you see some differences across time periods in agriculture is partly because of things like places that were going to be irrigated were not necessarily forecasting they were going to be irrigated in 1935. So again, for agriculture, it matters much more whether you use the 1935 endowment or the 2015 knowledge of the 2015 endowment, basically. So for agriculture, I think it's complicated by these changes, not just in agribusiness. You know, we need fewer people because we have better machinery, but also this shift that's related to the fact that you can now irrigate the Central Valley, even though, you know, whether or not that makes sense. But that's that. So I would say agriculture is a bit different than oil and coal in that respect. I don't know whether that answers your question, but Maybe we could talk more at lunch if you're interested.
So I have just a couple of thoughts or questions, but let me come back to agriculture because I think that's what I keep getting hung up in your first graph. So is this a measurement of sort of intensity of use of agricultural land, or is it more of a value of agricultural land in those particular areas?
So it is the value of agricultural land, and so we had this long debate because it was exactly, should we just use land and farms divided by square miles, or should we use value of land and farms divided by square miles? After sort of, I would say, doing some testing across seminars, people seem to like the value of land better than the land. So we've gone with that as our primary measure.
Yeah, because I think that's what concerned me, at least to begin with, is that if you think about the South, and what was, in the early years especially, what were the cash crops versus Indiana and Illinois and Iowa? It seems very, very different.
Yeah.
But then it seems like the next step is, how are those different, just stick with agriculture for a minute, how are those industries affected by not just the change in technology, but the change in markets in terms of imports and exports, and is that being captured as well?
Well, I mean, so anything that's incorporated into the value of land, so if we think that people are optimizing and that they have some ideas about what the future holds, and that's incorporated into the value of land that we're using, then it's just some kind of generic measure of what you think this land can generate, right, in whatever mix of crops is going to be relevant for the current environment, right? And I think that that's actually partly why, I mean, if you just look, there are some things here, like clearly I think this is sort of the Dust Bowl effect, right? Population growth is negative even during population increases. You're getting steady flows out. But, if you look over here, I think a lot of the fact that you're not getting much effect on per capita income is precisely because they're re-optimizing the crop mix as, as the world markets change, access to world markets change, and so forth. And so you're not, and some of it is, of course, that the population growth is maybe steadily enough moving out that even in the short run, you're getting some equilibration. In the long run, you certainly see that.
But certainly in agriculture, too, you may have very differences in sort of movement out of agriculture to something else in some areas compared to other areas.
Right, yeah. And so, part of the reason why we keep agriculture in here, despite the fact that initially Gary Livecap, I was at a conference when I gave an early version of this, a 10-minute talk in the Summer Institute, and he was like, why are you using agriculture?
Yes.
And I said, it's because it's this huge resource. We know that land is a huge natural resource, and it's interesting precisely because it's different, right? It's renewable as opposed to non-renewable, and so it provides some sort of comparison that allows you to think, I think, more clearly, perhaps not in this one, but it allows you to think about, what's happening in these different sectors and make some comparisons that I do think are interesting for understanding what's happening in these other sectors as well.
Okay, so we have Lee and then Jessica.
Yeah, for these endowments on coal and oil, and I know more about other minerals, reserves are always a function of price. So that, how do you deal with that?
Well, so it doesn't actually turn out to matter too much in the following sense. The numbers that we have are in units, so they're actually in tons of coal, for example. We can multiply them by the value in 1935, but because...
Oh, so they're not known reserves.
They are known reserves, like it's tons, right? So,
right, but that's a function of recoverable at a certain price.
Right.
So that if price expectations change, and so one would think that, I would have thought you'd have gotten a much bigger, it's nice how you did it for, 35 versus 2015 and went back because there's not that much difference.
Right.
But I would have thought there would have been, simply because of technological change had such a huge impact on what was recoverable at what prices. And then price spikes, suddenly reserves go way up.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing to remember is in 35, right, so these are shares, per square mile, and then we've rescaled them, so the top state is 1.
Right.
So anything that changes all of the states in a more or less constant way is not going to affect the relative ranking,
That's
right? So if everybody gets 20% more because of
Right.
new knowledge about reserves, that's not a problem.
That's
The thing
right.
we were worried about, and the reason why we actually did this 2015 thing, was because people kept saying things like, well, what about the Powder River Basin, right? Powder River Basin gets discovered, we didn't know as much about what was there before. It wasn't that we didn't know there was coal there, but I think the reserve expanded. And it turns out that it matters a little bit in the point estimates, but so I'm not going to tell you it doesn't matter at all. But qualitatively, the results we find here are very similar, right? And so that made us happy because, of course, the worst is when you measure it a different way.
Right.
Of course, you expect that there are going to be some differences. You don't expect it to be identical. But sometimes you measure it a different way and you get completely different results, and that's bad because then that sort of says how you measure it is incredibly important for what you find. And so we were relatively happy. And I think it's precisely because most of what's happening is this,
They're all moving together.
They're all moving together.
That's good.
Yeah.
One other data point. On agriculture, what about, there's a huge, there's always difficulty with measuring agricultural population and agricultural labor force because so much of it's seasonal and part-time and a lot of family labor as well varies during certain periods. How did you deal with that?
Okay, so
And it's going to vary a lot across certain states in terms of the amount of seasonal labor.
yeah, here's what we went with, right? We've got the decennial ones, and then there's this fancy database, the SEER database, where they basically, because we're in the period after all of the states are in the registration area, we can, basically they add births, subtract deaths, or whatever, and then make some adjustments so that the numbers at the endpoints match, but they basically use these births and deaths to fill in the data, as it were. So I think the answer is, if people are seasonally migrating from Mexico, for example, right, which is probably the thing you have in mind, because migration within, people who move to California migrate within California, that's not a problem, right? It's this state to state or country to state migration that's the problem. I don't think it's affecting the long run stuff very much, but it could be that some of what we're seeing here is actually impacted by that, and it may be something that we need to talk about a little bit more. Like, what do we know about migration flows during this period?
And I think some of this gets at Michael's point about spatial econometrics, because, for example, there were huge flows out of certain cities. Take Memphis. People were going out of Memphis over to Arkansas to pick cotton until the early 60s. So that's state to state, even though it's just across the bridge. So there are state and there's folks who sweep up and harvest different crops across states. Maybe it doesn't, just something to be concerned about.
We have worried about it a little bit, but it may be that if we do some of the spatial econometric stuff, it'll help capture that better. And I think, if nothing else, we should certainly mention this issue, because I think this issue is much less true of oil and coal in the sense that people tend to move there and stay there at least for a few years.
Right.
There isn't this, I'm going to state X for 2 months to pick whatever. And so I think that the issue here is much more severe, and if nothing else, we should at least have a footnote in which we sort of say, look, we know this is an issue. We're not sure that we can actually really deal with it beyond, what we've already done, but at least so that people are aware of it.
We got 3 on the queue. Let's try to get to those. Jessica, Tony, then Bernie. So Jessica, still there with us.
Yeah, so I think,
Sorry.
I think we got to a lot of it, but I still just wanted to follow up a little bit on this endowment measurement.
Mhm.
So, do we have endowment? I mean, so I know the mineral yearbook is year by year, right? So, I guess I'm still a little bit confused as to how to use the 1935 endowment at the state level that you then scale to 1, that remains constant until 2015, or doesn't?
Right, we don't rescale it. So we just scale you in 1935. You're the top state in 1935, or you're at 50% of the top state, or whatever.
Right.
And then we're interacting it. What we do in robustness checks is we just say, what if we use the scaling based on 2015, adding back all of the production to 1935, so that we don't somehow.
Okay, but that's not year. But those are not. Do those vary? I guess my question is, do those vary each year? I'm still not clear.
Oh, the endowments? No, they're fixed. They don't vary over time. The only thing that varies over time, so the shift share, we've got the shares, those don't vary over time. The shifting is coming from the changes in national resource employment.
But you're asking about the yearbook.
I'm asking.
The yearbook, you're going to
I'm
change.
asking in part because it seems like, I'm just wondering, it seems like you could have a year-on-year change in endowment and rescale it each year.
So it turns out that until fairly recently, there are not annual estimates of reserves. So they do it periodically, and so then so Alcott and Keniston use this dynamic reserve thing. I think this is kind of endogenous personally, so I really don't like it. We have experimented with that. We can basically construct an annual measure of endowment. We just don't do it because we don't think it's the right thing to do. But I mean, we've done it. It because it doesn't matter too much in 2015, and it relative to 1935, what that mostly is going to say, and in fact does say, if you use a dynamic number, is that it turns out not to matter a whole lot, right? For precisely the reasons you would expect, right? If everything's going up, but it's all going up at the same level. There's also, it makes it much more complicated because then you have to decide what you're going to do with the rescaling. Are you going to rescale then you really have to go to units, right?
Yeah.
I mean, and not that you can't, but the rescaling where we have the top state be 1, which is convenient for interpretation, you can't do that anymore, really, because different states are going to be the top. It just becomes very complicated.
Okay, so the top state of 1 stays the top state of 1 for the entire duration of the.
Yeah. So.
Okay, it was just a clarifying question.
Go ahead.
I'm sure Bernie has a better.
Well, we have time. You're first. Go for it.
All right. Well, so I understand your the reason for maybe kind of disaggregating these different resources, but when you put them all together, and a state is fortunate enough to have resources in oil, coal, and agricultural simultaneously, it's very resource rich. Is that diversification good for the state's outcomes, or does that just exacerbate the problem? And then, kind of a similar question: are there any interesting states that just kind of defy your predictions that deserve further investigation?
Okay, so I will tell you that one of the reasons why we wanted to use 3 resources was because we thought it would matter a lot that the estimates would shift a lot if you did all 3, which is going to account for the fact that perhaps, like, if agriculture is down but oil is up, you can move from agriculture to oil. It turns out, empirically, that the estimates, if you just estimate them separately, are not very different than if we estimate them jointly, which suggests that at least, based on what we've done so far, that the complementarities aren't that big. Because we exactly thought we either thought, well, maybe there are negative interaction effects, maybe there are positive interaction effects, maybe it would depend over time. It just turns out that it doesn't matter all that much, which we found a little bit surprising, but, again, part of it is there aren't too many states that have really large endowments of multiple things, right? Often you'll have a big endowment of 1 and then maybe some smaller. So there aren't too many states where they have just a lot of all 3.
Right.
So this follows up on his question kind of indirectly. You've got 3 natural resources you look at here. What about a 4th one, forests? And there is good data way back about forests. So I'm just curious, and I assume, gonna ask, and forests aren't included in ag.
Forests are not included in ag as currently defined. Yes, it doesn't mean we couldn't expand the definition, but not as currently defined. So the main reason that we didn't include forests, we thought about, like, are there other things we should be including? And I think, actually, maybe this doesn't have it, because in the end we didn't.
No, I looked on that list and it's not on there.
Yeah. So, the answer is, yeah, we looked at the value, and the value relative to agricultural output was just not all that huge, but we could do it. I mean, the answer is there's no good reason why we're not doing it, except that 3 seem like plenty of resources. But
If 3's good, 4 could be better.
4 could be better. 4 could be better, because, I mean, the other thing people look at is things like fisheries, right? I mean, so again, there is a kind of what's the optimal number, and if you guys have opinions, we can weigh in on this. We could do more. It wouldn't be the marginal cost of adding timber is not all that high.
Q is sort of run out.
I got a quick question.
Go ahead, Jeremy.
Going back to the South. So, have you considered let's just take the Confederate States and the states in the Union and let that be the subset? So, I mean, it is a very different group than all this other stuff out there, right?
Yeah, so what we do have right now is we've got census division year fixed effects, which allow for there to be effects basically that are affecting different groups of states. And so, because, for example, the South, has this huge increase, which is related in part, I think, to, or at least the literature suggests it's related in part to things like expansion of roads and railways and World War II investment that really transforms and helps modernize the South. So we didn't want that to be captured by, because it was correlated with these resources or something like that. So we've already implicitly, I think, controlled for a lot of this stuff. But one of the things that may be doing, and coming back to this, how much should you be controlling? We're actually experimenting. I think we're going to move to census region year fixed effects in part to allow a little bit more variation.
One other thing, to make the paper more institutional based, are price supports for agriculture.
Mm-hmm.
And, they varied over time and space in terms of what was covered. I mean, initially it was just the huge cash crops of cotton, wheat, corn, so on. And then that's expanded over time. But you would think that we'd have differential effects across states.
Right.
So it's, and the other thing about, timber, part of the problem is the government's so involved on most of those federal lands. So you've got whole different ballgames when you're leasing.
Well, it sure biases the states with large federal holdings, but
Yeah.
the East has very little federal land.
Oh, no, I agree. What I'm saying is there's these institutional differences of who owns what and whether you're subject to the whim of, leases or government supports for prices is going to add uncertainty to these things. So it adds a political dimension to this.
I would argue, though, that the political dimension is just as strong for coal and gas
Yeah,
in the West as it is for timber.
Yeah, and I punt on that because I don't know those things.
One
I
thing
wouldn't
that-
be surprised.
Actually, as I was talking to Jessica, it did occur to me that we could easily just try and put in some differential effects to test whether they're different, in the states with large federal holdings, and that at least would help sort of clarify, some of these issues a little bit.
So that'd be interesting because it also gets at the huge irrigation effect.
Yeah.
That you talked about.
Yeah.
From the 98 meridian on. Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay. You take 15, 16 seconds to wrap
No.
up.
Thanks a lot. This is super helpful because I think, as the paper kind of evolves, it's really important to get people to sort of help you think about, how to tell the story better, how to add in some of the institutional stuff that we know is lurking under the surface. So thank you.